Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Insight Live, the expert's take. I'm Carm Taglienti, and I'll be your host. As we go through the topic of cybersecurity today, we've got an old friend with us, Victor Aranda, as senior architect here at Insight, who's going to share with us some of his depth of expertise around cybersecurity. And along with him, we also have Xavier Lopez, who's a developer who also focuses on cybersecurity and building out solutions for our customers. So, welcome, Victor and Xavier. So, initially, let's just start off with, and I know this term is bandied about quite a bit. Let's start out with zero trust. And not from the perspective of what zero trust necessarily is, but what is it? What do we think it is in the grand scheme of things as it relates to what clients should really be concerned with? Because as we've talked about quite a bit, we know it's not necessarily a thing, but let's talk about what the concept really means. So, Victor, I'll pass it off to you. What do you think?
I've been I've been guilty of calling it a buzzword many times, which most of the time I see it used that way. And the kind of flippant answer I've always given is like zero trust is what we ought to have been doing this whole time.
Agreed.
Like what you guys have been trusting this whole time? No, we shouldn't have been, right? So in a way, it's a term. In the best case, it's a term that's arisen from the practices of information security, network security, identity, and so on over the course of the many years. But it still gets used far too often as a buzzword. One of the things I heard recently that I think characterizes it the best way is just to remove all implicit trust from the environment, remove any implied or assumed trust, identity, that kind of thing, so that you're just treating everything as if you almost like walking around your own house and you're like, you bump into your wife or something and say, "Who are you?" Show me, check your ID, papers, please.
Right.
And so in that term, it changes some of the design paradigms, but really not. It shouldn't really be changing that many of them. We should have been doing a lot of this stuff since the beginning. Now there are just tools and paradigms and so on that are make it easier to achieve what we would have called previously just being secure or having a secure environment.
Yeah, completely agree. Xavier, anything to add to that? You have a slightly different perspective, or?
Maybe another analogy I would say when I think of zero trust, I think of the HTTP protocol and statelessness. I like the idea of thinking that, every subsequent request knows nothing about the previous one. And that's just a general way I'd like to think of it.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I think the big point here is, and Victor, I think to what you're describing, it really is, I use the word buzzword, but in general, it just really tends to gain some focus in terms of this moniker called zero trust. And it's, are you really checking where you may have assumed there was trust in the system? And I think that's really important. So at least in my experience, I've seen a lot of cases where it's like, I really did assume that there was trust there. Yeah. Maybe I shouldn't have.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the point of trying to find out where they're eliminating all the implicit trust, right?
Exactly. And trying to find out where it exists, whether it's in the network, Xavier, as you had mentioned, or it's, maybe it's even in the people processes, where you say, well, I don't know who you are, but I'm still going to give you access to the system because I think you work for the company. That's probably a bad thing to do too, just in the grand scheme of things. So I think for a lot of our customers now, again, and I promise I'll stop talking about zero trust in a minute, but the companies come to us and they say, hey, we want you to create a zero trust solution for us. And so in a lot of ways, we can't really treat it as a thing necessarily, to your point. So how do we engage in a conversation with a customer where they want to, say, create zero trust? And how do we, help sort of usher them into this concept of, really looking at your architecture and understanding where the potential vulnerabilities might be?
Normally, when someone says that to me, we have to dig into what they mean.
Yeah.
They might have read hey, this is not to put them down or anything, but they might have read an article or something, and they came and they said, well, I want to do this thing too, right? I want to do zero trust. How do I do zero trust? Or they say, I'd like to take this particular technology or this area of IT and adopt zero trust policies or what have you. We always have to unpack that with the customer and figure out what it is that they actually want to do, because behind the term, of course, there's a lot of complexity and and nuance. And so if they're talking about zero trust from a data center networking standpoint, or they're talking about zero trust from a campus in device identity standpoint and the network access control, there's different angles on it. It's rarely the whole thing. It's rarely that someone say, hey, I want to re-envision my entire architecture. Usually it boils down to something that's tactical. And we end up finding what I would call low-hanging fruit, with meaningful impact can be realized with an engagement or a few changes, or maybe even the replacement of a system, and it ends up being a significant reduction in that implicit risk. Now, have they then achieved zero trust? No, not really. I mean, you could argue that you never do,
right?
But they've gotten closer to it in a meaningful way, and that's usually what happens when someone asks. I would like to have one zero trust, please, Carm.
Right.
Say, yeah, okay, we want fries with that.
Yeah, I have one for you, actually.
You have one? Oh man, so I have one to give.
Indeed. Xavier, from maybe a network or an implementation perspective, a lot of times you were mentioning HTTP. So it's like, okay, so if we look at it from maybe the TCP protocol perspective, or maybe other characteristics of the network, I mean, do we really have to worry about, say, all 7 layers of the OSI model or of the IP model? Do we just deal with the TCP side of it or the IP, or is it everywhere? How do we really think about it from a network perspective?
I think it's everywhere. I think also it could be a little overwhelming. And I agree with what Victor said. I think it's highly dependent on the environment. And I think the best that you can do to get the ball rolling is identify some low-hanging fruit. For example, in our CI/CD pipelines, we've identified some low-hanging fruit, such as centralized credential and secrets management, image scanning, TLS everywhere in our Kubernetes clusters, and no root. No non-root containers.
No containers running as root. It's usually a good first start.
That's 4 of them. After we recently had some discussions, and those are 4 of them that we feel like we need to get implemented ASAP.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest open issues is the repository issue, right? The repository question is like, I want to get started doing Kubernetes, or I want to get started playing with CloudFormation templates or Terraform or something. Let me just pull this thing down and run it. And almost without fail, those sample or example templates or Docker files have a number of things that everything from old components that are introducing vulnerabilities, or setting up an environment that doesn't take advantage of all the settings that really ought to be there. And so there are tools that help with that, but it's a classic example of, like, this is probably fine. We'll just pull this thing down. The person who wrote this must have looked into it, so it should be all right. And then they find out down the road, like, oops.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the key to that is you got to keep learning, because it's one thing to set up an environment that spans multiple layers of your OSI model, for example, as you were suggesting, Carm. But it's another thing to understand every single bit of it the minute you deploy it all. You're going to set it up first, and you're going to learn some of these things later on. So you just got to keep studying your environment to find out where your weaknesses are.
That comes to another. Go ahead, Carm.
I was going to change the topic a bit, but no, go ahead, please.
Well, one of the things that I keep harping on is that the IT skills of yesteryear, they're not really irrelevant, right? You still have to know networking. You still have to know, network security, or at least have a basic understanding, systems administration, and, maybe some protocols. The things that would make make the royal you, a good IT architect, engineer, technician in the past are still here, but now there's this kind of blossoming of technologies supporting DevOps and this extremely fast development and deployment. What I'm finding is that those skill sets are increasingly not just in demand, but there's an expectation. You have to know these things. Within a few years, within 5 years, I think 5 to 10 years, it's going to be table stakes. It's the word that basically every org has to have those skill sets and turned towards a security bent to really understand what they're doing, because otherwise they're going to be moving too fast for their own good. And the legacy skill sets, even though they're there and you still have to have them, security folks are going to need to know what are your developers doing? What are their pipelines looking like? Where are you applying checks? And right now, I think that's a distant idea for most customers, or most folks are on their beginning of their journey there. And some of them are already doing this, but definitely a developing area of tech where investment in those skill sets is going to be very valuable for the traditional IT person. And I say that as a traditional IT person, and with Xavier as a developer first, we kind of have met in the middle. I remember years ago going down to El Segundo in California and doing a training with Xavier, and he was like, "Well, here's what Docker is, guys. Let me explain Docker to you." And we were all throwing spitballs and stuff, all the architects, and we were listening and learning. But looking back, boy, that was prescient to go over that. Even when was that? It was like 2017 or something.
Yeah, it's a while back.
We both had so much more hair.
I think so. I mean, listening to you guys talk, it feels very much like, I'll call it the old way of practicing security was sort of applying security after the fact. Like, I come from a development background as well. We used to develop applications, and then we would think about security afterwards. It's like we develop in sort of this, pristine environment, everything worked, and then later on we'd be like, yeah, we should probably add some roles and add some security. Maybe it'll work. But that was not the way it is today. So security built in, or sort of this cultural aspect of security, I think is really important, whether it's in the DevOps pipeline, CI/CD, or even the way that we configure and use services. I mean, in the grand scheme of things. And so, it feels like this model becomes one of criticality, if you will, because we don't necessarily want to have to think about it after the fact. But I mean, are you guys both seeing, from the perspective of your customers, are customers more attuned to building in security in, or do they sort of push back a little bit and say, well, I don't, we really don't need to do pen testing as part of our CI/CD pipeline? You probably aren't hearing that, but in general, I mean, sometimes you might think, well, it's more expensive or whatever. So is there some enablement that has to occur as people start thinking about this new model of doing things? So
Jay, you want to take a stab at that one?
Well, my approach is, again, always try to take a very large problem, a sprawling problem, and reduce it down to manageable chunks. So when it comes to customer concerns about security, for example, what I like to do is ask them exactly what their concerns are in order to, so for example, if we're offering a product that involves a cloud resources provision to the cloud, and within that container orchestration solution, and within that an application that they're ultimately is the reason for our engagement, and in and amongst that security rules and ingress and egress and ACLs and various subnets and all that type of stuff, and they have security concerns, I like to say, well, exactly what are they, so that we can attack them specifically. But if they say that they're not interested in the product because they, for example, aren't interested in dealing with are putting their data in the cloud, then that's just a little bit too vague for us to deal with. And so that's where the back and forth begins. So I'm always trying to say, tell us exactly what your concerns are so that we can deal with them.
It's interesting. We deal with different kinds of customers too, as I'm typically on the infrastructure side, or at least that's where I came from. My pedigree is in network engineering and network security, and Xavier's as a developer and developer consultation, right? Developing for customers or working with developers. And so we probably have different slices, but what you mentioned, Carm, about shifting left in the process is that is absolutely happening. And I have a great slide. I'm not going to pop it up here, but we've talked to it at length enough times that I could probably do it. And that is, if you imagine the life cycle of a product, as it's going from right to left. It goes from inception to the point where it's actually being purchased and utilized. What could be a SaaS application, it could be a monolithic applications that's installed in someone's data center. But the point is that when we come at a traditional, excuse me, frog in my throat. When we come at this from a traditional standpoint of, well, you need to have a SIM, and you need a firewall, and you need endpoint protection, and you need you need user behavior analytics, and you need load balancer that has some security features, and you need TLS forward proxy, you need all these different things. Those are all on the far end. Those are trying to catch the thing that's happened. It's trying to catch the bad guy. It's trying to catch the bad email that got through. It's trying to catch the exfiltration or even the outbound click from the phishing email. It's trying to catch the malware that got delivered. But for the most part, those all arrive in the software, in the development process, right? In a lot of cases, we know what those vulnerabilities are before they even get weaponized. And so to your point, Carm, shifting left is kind of the goal. Is that we're trying to move up the stack or up, the chain, so to speak, left in the process to go and support what are essentially the developers and teams. Could be a like platform engineering team or something, to get guardrails put in place, checks put in place, and CI tools and so on, so that those issues are avoided and they don't end up making it into production and then making it into a news article down the road.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that the far right side, all those tools and stuff, go away. Of course, just like the IT skills that I mentioned earlier, they still have to go. It's table stakes now. You can't just go, we're going to go with that. We're zero trust. We don't even have a firewall, But you can wrap up a lot of these things in the development process and not have them, present an issue that you have to track down the road. So just in terms of nipping them in the bud, that's the biggest. Speaking of low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah, prevention, I think, is really the key here, right? So as opposed to detection and remediation after the attack occurs, that's not what you want to be doing, I'm sure.
No. And then just think about the backlog from a development standpoint. Right. If someone comes to you and says, hey, all these issues now need to be fixed, what if you could have solved those before you even push a code out?
Yep. Totally. Yeah. Do you guys think, how about the, we talked a little bit about the cloud or even modern application style. So the cloud, which is basically infrastructure being managed by a separate party, or even, if we move to containers, basically the abstraction of the operating system. So just one less thing to think about. Does it make things easier for us or harder, or just changes the picture?
My take is it changes the picture.
Same here.
Yeah, it introduces new problems. Although some of them go away, it introduces a bunch of new ones. So they go from having a musket to shoot themselves in the foot with, to having an AR-15 to shoot themselves in the foot with, and so the thing is far more capable, but it's just as capable of inflicting self-inflicted damage. I would say that go ahead, Xavier. I think you had something you wanted to say on this.
No, I agree with where you're going with this. I think it turns one from a developer who was kind of, this is how my evolution has happened. So I was a developer who got interested in, speaking of shifts, I shifted over to operations and became a DevOps guy. But I think that the shift continued to happen. The evolution continued to happen. I became more of a site reliability engineer. I think because I had to pay attention. There's a book, I can't remember the name of it, but it was a book about Google, and it was a bunch of um, case studies, and I think it said in there that they came up with a term, site reliability engineer, and they defined it as consisting of someone who spanned the domains of layer 2 and layer 3 networking, software engineering, and system administration. And I think that's exactly right. And I think that shift that you just asked about kind of pushes you in that direction where you're sitting on the fence of all three of those domains.
Yeah.
So a variety of skills, I think, in the grand scheme of things. Did
Yeah.
If we think about, we were talking about customers just a little while ago. And normally, and again, and I'm not belittling security at all, but I get the feeling like a lot of customers are either sort of dragged kicking and screaming by compliance regulations to adopt a better security posture, or a breach, Victor, to your point. So it's like, we had something happen and we better fix it, or we need to fix it because of reputational loss or whatever. So those are important considerations. But I mean, are we seeing, at least from your both of your perspectives, we're seeing a lot of customers that are looking at this from the proactive, saying, we don't want that to happen to us. We need to adopt a better security posture, because it's the right thing to do, or even from an ROI perspective. I'm asking a really complicated question now, because somehow we have to integrate the ROI as well. So I don't know. Maybe Xavier, I'll start with you. Are you seeing that from customers where they're coming in, they're saying, we haven't had an issue, but we want to make sure that we adopt a better posture because it will save us money in the long run? Victor kind of alluded to this with, it's much more costly to fix a problem after an attack occurs. So is that sort of resonating in the industry these days?
Yeah, we're seeing a concerted effort to attack security issues before we move into the deployment of products that we're setting up for them, for sure. Some of them are, for example, just completely reject. Brings me back to my previous comments. Some of them completely reject, for example, cloud deployments. Now, and this is, I'm curious. I'd like to get them into conversations, though I'm not always in the position to do so. I'd like to get them in a position to discuss exactly what those concerns are so that we can improve our cloud offerings, our cloud, how we're managing our cloud offerings. But yeah, I definitely see a more concern in that area.
For me, it's case by case. I think there's a selection bias in the kind of customers that a consultancy tends to work with. The ones who have it all figured out, probably exemplary, and they're on the bleeding edge. They're not really tapping our shoulders saying, hey, can you help us? And so very rarely do you get to see an environment like that where you go and you're like, oh wow, you guys really have it sorted out. This is great. And sometimes they want that feedback because they're not sure. It's typically the folks that are executing some of these things at a very mature level that I think they're the collective imposter syndrome kind of kicks up, and they go, really? I don't kind of glad that we're doing it well. Great, fantastic, thank you. But right. There are some, speaking of kicking and screaming, the other situations that we get ourselves into sometimes are customers where there's not a fantastic relationship between, for example, security and developers, and that's happened, traditionally between IT and security, and very similar. Like, we need you guys to lock these things down. Here are the rules you have to follow. Hey, why can't you just make my life easier? I'm just trying to get my job done. That same paradigm continues, in the developer versus information security group sort of interaction. And so some customers come to us and we're talking to a security team who says, help. How do we wrap this thing up? How do we get our developers to follow, these rules, or what are the different tools and mechanisms we have in place to put guardrails in effect, and limit sometimes, some of the things that they can do. Again, this is a story that's as old as the cloud itself, right? And on the other hand, we've got some folks coming in that are like, look, InfoSec is asking us to do all these different things. Is there a tool, or are there things that we can do to satisfy what they're asking for? And there are products that do that, and there are techniques and kind of implementations of cloud native tools that can do some of these things. But for the most part, it tends to be one or the other, and every so often you'll get them kind of rowing in the same direction, and that's perfect.
Got it. Yeah, no, it's that's great point. When you were talking, it made me think along the lines of, is there a pristine environment anywhere? It sounds highly customized is where I'm kind of getting to, but it's like it's a combination of interpretation of requirements, understanding the actual application and network environment, and what needs to be achieved from a communications perspective. So it feels like this is still a very custom thing in the grand scheme, which is okay. But I think it's it's not the kind of thing that most people are probably going to go off and kind of do it on your own, right? Because the problem with that, I would assume, is that if you get it wrong, there really are no takebacks, right? So I mean, if you have a major security breach, it's kind of too late, right? So anyways, those are the kinds of things that I think are important. So what would you both sort of recommend in terms of like, how do you start? Like, do you're not going to hire your own CISSP person, maybe if you're a small company, or maybe you already have one, but like, what are kind of the best tacks in terms of, how do you adopt a better posture? Like, how would you recommend people start in general? So I don't know, Victor, you want to start with that one? Or maybe you might tell me you're crazy, go get a PhD in it, and we'll talk about it later.
No. What I'm thinking is that let's think of the goal in mind for that particular customer. What are they trying to achieve? And if we're talking about someone who's doing application development in an agile methodology, and they're actually going after a real goal, then they probably have the people and the skills that they would need to do the roll your own parts. And it's not that it's out of reach, it's just being cognizant of them and following them, rather than it's a little bit like it's not that they would be incapable of taking these steps of protecting themselves and using cloud native tools or integrating a third-party tool or something, or a variety of tools. It's that they typically don't ask. It's that kind of, let's just rush out and do it because it's easy.
Right.
Knee-jerk reaction. There's also the quintessential leave it. This is just a temp solution, and then it ends up in production, 5 years later. That I've seen a number of ways, both from a developer standpoint as well as from like a network engineering standpoint, where it's like, this switch says it's temp switch 001. Who did this? It's singly connected. Oh, that was Bob did that years ago, but haven't had a chance to take it out and fix it. So I think diligence is like the least sexy word, right, in the IT parlance, but it actually counts for a lot. Being diligent about how you roll things out and asking the questions that you should, especially if you're a beginner, and then being diligent about maintaining what you're doing as you're doing it, so that your environment doesn't end up with a bunch of cruft and garbage, and makes it difficult for the next person to try to figure out what you were doing, because there's no naming convention, there's no tagging, it's not clean. That actually accounts for a lot of time that has to go into figuring out what was done previously, when there's inevitably another group or person who has to come in and figure it out. So if you're starting out on this journey, read as much as you can. Don't assume that you know everything, and don't assume that you can get it all done yourself. You might need help.
Right. Yeah, it's great. Xavier, you got a perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that the best thing you can do is, I would just say two things. One, communicate very clearly what it is that your customers are looking for. Try to shake out their actual concerns. Then two, documentation. And documentation, and for developers, I suggest infrastructure as code. So get this stuff codified. And over time you maintain it, and as Victor was saying, keep the cruft out, because it'll happen. Stuff gets in there that and I've constantly having to shake out my own infrastructure as code and going, well, I know I must have done that for some reason. I can't remember exactly why I put that there, but let me get it out of there because it
Can I
serves.
delete that without breaking anything? Let's find out.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I was just doing the very same thing. One thing I eliminated, nothing happened. I checked, everything was still working. The second thing I eliminated because it really didn't make any sense. I couldn't figure out why it was there. I'm talking about an ingress rule, and it broke everything. So I had to put it back. And I have to go back and figure out exactly why that's there in the first place. But it's that type of thing. Documentation in the case of, or in the form of infrastructure as code, and very clear, diligent communication with your end users.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, it's worth digging into a little bit. Going back and fixing the stuff afterwards, after or post facto, is a lot of work, and especially when you've got, it's something as simple as an NSG on a group, or what, depending on which cloud you're in and how do you want to which term you want to use. But the point is that having some kind of IP restriction or allowance on a group, or a load balancer or a virtual machine or what have you, if it's too broad, let's say someone went in there and said, I'm going to have to SSH for this, to this thing. I don't want to know which IPs I'm going to have to come from. I'm just going to put a SSH permit in there and it'll be fine. Then someone finds out, down the road, through a tool or something, they see it, it's audited, what have you, and we have to go and fix this. Now, SSH might not be a fantastic example, but let's just say for hypothetical purposes that is part of the function of the application, or there's 5 or 6 people that have to get in to maintain this thing or to make it work. You can't just go and remove that rule. Now it becomes a research project, right? Who is talking to this thing? Who needs this? Do we need separate rules for this? Do we need, is there an approval that I have to go through InfoSec and change management and all that kind of stuff? Where if it had just been done, correctly in the first place, and especially if it had been done where the rule elements or the policy elements had annotations, and this is Carm, this is Xavier, this is Victor coming in, this is for inter-application communication with this other thing here, it becomes very easy to maintain. Whereas just going and trying to remove remove the permissive rule is potentially breaking, and it becomes, like I said, it becomes a who's using this, who's hitting it, where, how is it frequently used? It's a nightmare. So diligence actually matters quite a bit.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it sounds very well disciplined, first of all, but secondly, like more of an engineering practice model, as opposed to a, hey, let's wait and see what happens and then we'll fix it. We probably don't want to do too much of that in this world, although I guess we do want to anticipate a little bit of it, because the unexpected, when something occurs, we want to make sure that we can be able to remediate it. But in general, the disciplined approach is really the way to go here because of the severity or the potential impact that's available. What about turning a little bit to the future? So like, where would you, like in the next 3 to 5 years? So, and I'll ask you both the same question. So like, where would you see things going, in the future? Like, how can things get any easier, or how can the posture potentially change? Like the things that might be of concern for us today, which kinds of things will maybe get easier in terms of, creating a more simplistic security posture or protecting our information more effectively? So Victor, you want to start?
Yeah, I think tools are going to make it easier. There's a lot of knowledge that can be embedded in a good tool, and it can be brought to bear at just the right time. I'll mention like Chekhov and tools like that. That's the Bridge Crew plugin for VS Code, but there are others, right, where you're getting feedback right there in the IDE, and that I think seeing security remediation suggestions in the IDE as you're writing your CloudFormation templates, as you're writing your Terraform files and stuff, I think will make a big difference. Once that capability, or once that feature, once that practice, however you want to slice it, becomes mainstream, and it turns into like a table stakes thing again. everyone has this, and it becomes not an exotic idea that you might have these checks and these capabilities. It becomes standard. That's what I think we'll see in the next few years. Like it'll become a capability that all IDEs have with standard standard findings or standard recommendations for this component or that component. And I think you nip a lot of the issues in the bud. You're not going to get rid of the really exotic exploits, like 0 days that some foreign nation state is working on, but a lot of the we shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
Low hanging fruit, right? Will be addressed. I think at least partially with the ability to fix these things in codes, like just either suggesting or straight up saying you have to have this or you have to have that, or hey, did you forget to put encryption on this S3 bucket? Right. Why can everyone access this? Those kinds of things.
Got it. Awesome. Great perspective. Thanks. Xavier, how about you?
I agree. I think automation is important. I think it's getting to the point where more of the tools like the ones Victor suggested are becoming automatically part of your development process, your development delivery process. I think that's a nice trend for a couple of reasons. I think because developers have their hands full. Their environments are complex as well, and they're constantly moving in new directions and taking on new challenges. And I think the more that we can allow developers to be developers and not overwhelm them with new CLI tools that they need to learn how to use in order to help move product delivery, by automating them, I think that the better we'll be as a team. And I'm all for crossing over into new domains, but oftentimes developers or whoever it is, whichever domain, they're not that interested in. Only some of us want to cross over. So I think if we can keep developers just developing, I think that's better that's a good option for everyone involved.
Just to throw something way out there, I think is fascinating, is some of the transformer models that are coming out of OpenAI and Google and stuff are able to synthesize text, to a degree that's fairly astounding. And there's a few papers and write-ups on synthesizing source code based upon a prompt. And again, we're scratching the surface of this capability from a machine learning standpoint, but we might get to the point where you're writing pseudocode,
right? And
you're not doing almost any of the actual, Python or what have you that you previously would have done 100% of. I don't know how realistic that is, but it certainly seems like it's on the cusp of being a real thing, right? Almost to the point like you could be an author and you write a few prompts and GPT-3 kicks out a novel, that is defensible and believable. So if you're thinking 5+ years out there, Carm, that's something I would keep my eyes on because I think it's pretty interesting. Or maybe just AI based analysis of the code so that it's not using static rules. It's just you don't have to maintain, or the company doesn't have to maintain all these different rules anymore. It's just using an inference engine to analyze what you're doing. But
right,
yeah, who knows where we're going?
Yeah, it's I'm glad you hit on that because I was going to teach you guys. It's like no mention of AI. That's amazing, but you did it. So
I had to.
I've had a little exposure personally in the area of policy definitions by using ontology frameworks. So it's exactly what you're talking about. It's sort of creating policies without necessarily specifying exactly how they're implemented, but it's sort of the semantic nature of the policy. So then how it's interpreted is, sort of bringing in some of what you're talking about. So I think that's probably something too, where, we start to move toward the future. The essence of the policy, not necessarily the specifics. So, but I think we're a little ways away from that, but it's moving in the right direction. So that's awesome.
Like everything else in that space, it'll come crashing through the wall like the Kool-Aid man right before you least expect it.
Right. Yeah, that's a great analogy. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure speaking with you both today. certainly, I sort of saw your vision of the future. Any final parting words for the group that's listening in, and any words of advice that you might have?
Read everything
Read
you can. Yeah.
and practice.
There's
Right?
there's a ton of stuff out there. There's more stuff out there than you could consume in an entire lifetime, right? So this proliferation of advice is not worthless. You go and read, and then you might find different opinions, and that's actually helpful because then you can start comparing them and making a decision on which one you should follow.
I agree. Keep learning, keep talking to people, keep reaching out to people in areas where you need a little bit of help, make alliances, and keep moving forward.
Yeah, lifelong learners, right? This is definitely one of those areas.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for attending today. Thank you to our guests. Certainly, Victor and Xavier, pleasure speaking with you both. Love your perspectives and the information you shared with us. If you want to know more about what we do or talk to somebody who talks like we do, please visit us at solutions.insight.com, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.